Origin Gents, reaction, and this is The Rape of Belgium. Well, that's a rosy title. And the Battle of Tannenberg. The Great War Week 5. Yeah, another Great War video. This is the 5th video in a proper series. We also watched the prelude of it. So, yeah. During their advance through Belgium, the German army is committing atrocities against Belgium's civilians, justified as a response to resistance and sabotage against their advancement. The Austro-Hungarian army is perpetuating massacres. Wait a minute, do I know this? I think I know this. Oh yeah, wait a minute. There's basically circulated pamphlets in London and everywhere, right? Like how Germans are raping people and just killing people in mass, shooting them while they were leaning against the wall at mass, mass killing and raping of Belgian people. There was pamphlets and things were circulating in London, right? I remember that watching for some of the videos. Damn, that's heavy. Against the Serbian civilian population to retaliate against Serbian guerrilla warfare. At the Eastern Front, German generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff succeed in one of the most important battles of World War I, the Battle of Tannenberg. It's really hard to read while there's a massive light in front of me, but yeah. Alright, let's do this one.
August 28, 1914. Throughout August 1914, as the war progressed in Belgium, France, and Serbia, the Austrian and German High Command either sanctioned or ignored the widespread execution and rape of civilians. A shocked and revolted world looked on. My name is Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War. Here's where we stood on the battlefields of Europe at the beginning of the week. In the west, there were 3 German armies, 750,000 men. The left flank was in Lorraine, and the rest were marching through Belgium at 30 kilometers per day, an amazing speed, and pretty much slaughtering the French armies they encountered. And the British Expeditionary Force under John French was approaching from the west. In the east, the Germans were on the retreat out of East Prussia, and the Russians were advancing. Now, in the west, after all the victories of the past few weeks, things were looking good for the Germans, but their reputation was doing anything but that. And the atrocities the German troops committed against civilians in the west grew and grew. In Dinant, German soldiers repairing a bridge were fired on by a few Belgian civilians, and as a reprisal, over 600 Belgian men, women, and children were shot. On August 20th, it happened in Andenne. There was even a printed announcement from German General von Bülow, posted in Liège, that read the following. The population of Andenne, after manifesting peaceful intentions towards our troops, attacked them in the most treacherous manner. With my authorization, the general who commanded these troops has reduced the town to ashes and shot 110 persons.
Now what the fuck? A general gave that order? War crime at this level, right? I mean, how does that, how do you sell that to anyone, right? How do you present that in any way? Certain elements of a society shot at your troops, so you hold the entire town responsible and burn the town to the ground and shoot 110 people. I mean, that's just fucked up, right? It's like, fuck it, one attack us, it's like all of them attacked us, just burn it to the ground.
In Tamim, 384 men were rounded up near the church and shot. In Rossignol, 122 people were executed for supposedly supporting the French army, who had just themselves been crushed there in battle. Now, there were dozens more such incidents, known collectively as the Rape of Belgium. But in Louvain, it was completely out of control. The Germans had occupied Louvain on August 19th, right? On the 25th, the Belgian army, coming from Antwerp, harassed the Germans. But once this was over, the German command decided the people of Louvain were to blame. So for the next 5 days, the German troops executed hundreds of citizens of both sexes, including many clergy, and burned the city and many of its famous medieval buildings. In the international press, there were horrible eyewitness accounts and even a headline in the New York Tribune, Germans sack Louvain, women and clergy shot. 10,000 civilians were driven from the city.
Look, I constantly said that, world wars were very specific. World War II was, a battle of ideology where there was literally a evil like Hitler and Nazis that people fought. While World War One, it was a bit different since nations are fighting. There is no one particular evil. But I don't know, man. If German army and the command basically executes entire towns and burn entire towns to the ground because few guerrilla groups basically attack them, they hold entire towns as responsible and do this kind of a war crime. All right, I don't know, man. To me, it seems pretty simple that Germany is evil in World War One, right? Because if certain people did that shit, heinous things happened in war. I understand that, all right? That's just the fact of war. But if German command generals are giving these orders openly to the public, like we are doing this, that's just no. After that, there is no going back, right? That's just fucked up.
In total, over 6,000 civilians are known to have been killed in cold blood in Belgium and France by Germans in the first weeks of the war. Now, I have to point out that some people today believe that the charges of war crimes against Germany in occupied Belgium and France are greatly exaggerated or even fabricated. But this is completely at odds with contemporary evidence. And it's important to note that these crimes were not only tolerated by military command, but in many cases, even sanctioned by them.
What the fuck?
The stories of
Is it any surprising that after this, few decades after in World War II, Nazis were one of the most fucked up people that ever lived, did the most fucked up thing ever. Hitler, who was part of World War I, who was serving there as a corporal, I think, he probably, saw how it's done because this is how the chain of command of Germany was. This is their thinking. So is it, any surprise that in World War II, Nazis were that fucked up? Because this is how the Germans were at the time. Right, during the World War One, they are doing this shit. So during the World War Two, of course, they did even more heinous things. Right, Germany and Austria, basically, that Armenian genocide and everything. Now Belgium, rape of Belgium, killing mass people. Right, raping, killing them, burning entire town because certain group of guerrilla battle basically, attacked their soldier. This kind of way of thinking, how can you go past that? Germany was evil in this war, right? Because if chain of command says that. General openly give statements like that. I mean, yeah.
German atrocities were particularly abundant in the British papers, where propagandists wanted to move away from the killing of an aristocrat in a faraway country to atrocities closer at hand in Belgium as a moral imperative for fighting the war. Now, this would motivate the British troops enormously when, on August 23rd, the Germans ran into the British for the first time in the war at the Battle of Mons.
Oh,
now, the
man,
German High Command had been
fucked up.
mocking the British Army for weeks and joking that they should just send the police to arrest them. But the British regulars, the only fully professional army in Europe before the war, held off the numerically superior Germans for many hours, inflicting 3 times the losses they took themselves.
Damn.
German howitzers arrived
Quality
in the
or
afternoon,
quantity?
though, with which the British artillery could not compete, and the British began to retreat, parallel to the French retreat as the Germans quickly pushed through Belgium and slaughtered the unprepared French army. There was heavy fighting for the British along the retreat over the next few days, especially when they turned and held their ground on August 26 at Les Cateaux, long enough for thousands of men to withdraw in good order. A British general, Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, had decided to stop and fight as the Germans were so close and the rearguard divisions were becoming so scattered that a catastrophic battle was otherwise inevitable. Smith-Dorrien was a general who had seen a lot of action for over 30 years all over the world with the British colonial army, and he knew what he was doing. Although the action that day would prove deadlier for the British army than the D-Day invasion 30 years later, Smith-Dorrien would give his army a 12-hour start on the Germans. But the troops were exhausted, and there was now even talk in the air that the war would indeed be over by Christmas, but with Germany the victor. Although on the Eastern Front, things to that point...
Germany was such a powerhouse overall that, obviously morale would take a hit with British and French people. Like, okay, it doesn't matter what we do, Germany might win by the Christmas. That's just heavy.
Hadn't been going well at all for the Germans, especially after their recent defeat at Gumbinnen, which caused the German retreat. After this, German Army Chief of Staff von Moltke dismissed his paranoid General von Prittwitz and brought General von Hindenburg out of retirement to replace him. Now, Hindenburg had retired in 1911, but unlike many of the European generals so far this war, Hindenburg had seen action, going as far back as the 1860s. Now, on the surface, things look good for the Russians, right? But they had colossal logistic and communications problems. They didn't even encode their telegrams, so all wire communications could be monitored by anyone.
Damn.
One tiny event occurred that had huge later repercussions.
Okay, what the fuck? They didn't even do anything to mask it, so German can easily just read all the messages and like, oh, this can't be that easy.
After the Battle of Gumbinnen, a note was found on a dead Russian officer that outlined most of the Russian plans for their offensive. Armed with this knowledge, Hindenburg and his second-in-command Ludendorff broke off the German retreat and decided to go on the attack. On August 24th, the Russians collided with the Germans.
Was that real thing or was that deception? I mean, I don't know.
And the Russian center made great progress, but it was a complete illusion. On the 26th, the German western flank cut through the Russian left and cut off communications. And on the 27th, the German eastern flank did the same thing to the Russian right flank. The Russian army was trapped in the middle, running out of basically everything. And on all
Of course, it wasn't deception. It was a real thing. Somebody found the entire Russian plan on a dead soldier somewhere. Of course, Tsar Nicholas was in power. It's not surprising. Later on, he'll just realize, screw it. I'm gonna lead this army. Yeah, nothing can go wrong with that.
August 28th, they began surrendering in droves, nearly 100,000 men, with 50,000 more killed or wounded over the course of only several days. This was the most spectacular defeat of the war and made Hindenburg a German national hero, even if much of the credit rightly belonged to the ironically named German General Francois. Now, there was a village nearby named Tannenberg, where in a medieval battle, the Slavs had defeated the Teutonic Knights, and this village gave its name to the battle, which would become a big symbol of German pride. This was a big moment because it put East Prussia now totally under German control. But further south, Germany's ally, Austria-Hungary, was having huge difficulties with control, which the Austrian army used as an excuse for wartime atrocities of their own. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had launched this war in the first place to teach Serbia a lesson, or maybe even end her existence. So there was no love lost between the two.
That wasn't maybe, that was the reason. They wanted to take Serbia over and, basically cut off any freedom of Serbia element from it.
And when Austria-Hungary invaded, it provoked widespread Serbian civilian resistance to the invading army. Guerrilla warfare. Now this really upset the Austrians, particularly their stuck-in-the-past aristocratic military leaders who wanted the war conducted on their terms, and they decreed that they would deal with civilian resistance ruthlessly. And they did, shooting, hanging, and bayoneting Serbian civilians, most of whom were innocent, men, women, and even children.
What the
But the
fuck?
Serbian guerrillas were good at creating chaos in the Austrian lines, often waiting for them to pass before sniping them with rifles from behind. This was effective, but it had its cost. An estimated 3,500 Serbian civilians were executed during just the first 2 weeks of the August campaign. And we have a lot of evidence of this because executing Serbian civilians was not something the Austrians tried to hide. In fact, Austrian Army Chief of Staff Konrad von Hotzendorf wanted people to see these punishments, so many of the executions of civilians were photographed and the photos were published. Mass executions and mass graves. And here we are at the end of the week.
Alright, first of all, Germany, you're raping and killing mass villages in Belgium. What we should do? Oh, I know. Let's do the same thing in Serbia, right? Let's create the genocide there. And I want people to know that because they think they're still living in, I guess, a few centuries ago where there was kings and everything, and kings made example of towns because they were kings. Forgetting one thing, that this is 20th century, right? Now it's a global superpower thing, right? There are other countries who would see how fucked up that is. You probably would join, and your, the old kingman type of mentality doesn't work anymore. You can't just do atrocity and nobody does anything about it. Holy shit, that was so fucked up. I mean, this just made easier, right? To people basically, do somewhat of a propaganda. Like, see how fucked up Germany and Austria is. We have to join the war just for the moral sake. I mean, that was just fucked up, man.
With Germany ascendant in both the East and the West, and a terrified citizenry, including over 1 million Belgians, fleeing from the invaders. Now, many formerly anti-war people decided this week that the war was, after all, justified, and that Germany must be stopped at all
There you go.
costs to preserve civilization in Europe. And we see, years later, that the massacres of civilians by the Germans in August 1914 were a direct factor in the harsh conditions imposed on Germany after the war, which indirectly, or maybe even directly, led to Nazism and the Second World War. That's all for this week. Click
Yeah, I understand that this kind of a heinous shit even pisses me off. I understand the, basically how all the sanctions and things were put on, right? Treaty of Versailles and things like that. Yeah. So, things like that basically, made Germany, punished Germany really hard. After seeing all this shit, it's understandable. But, people have to understand, two wrongs don't make it a right? I mean, this basically fueled anger in German people because they were literally starving after World War I. And that basically made people listen to Hitler and Hitler's idea and basically led to World War II. So, it's understandable from German people's side, like they were starving, they didn't have money to buy food because how things were going on. But it's also understandable from the Allied side because look at how heinous shit was happening. And they were proud of it. They were basically publishing it. Look at that, we're doing this. German generals are, see, I gave the order to kill and burn entire towns down. In Austria, they just send out like as a warning. See that we just did a genocide here of our own. Germany did it in Belgium, we did it in Serbia. Like it's something of a pride. They were still living in the old mentality where they think they can do heinous shit as some kind of warning. You can't do that shit in 20th century. Come on, man. People will see like this is way too much, right? I mean, you can't do war crimes like that and still people don't get angry about it, right? If at the start of the war, they were acting like, assassination of Archduke is a good excuse so people don't get angry. After war starts, they're doing this heinous shit. Didn't they realize, okay, all other powerful nations will basically join forces because what we're doing, the kind of message we are sending. So I understand that. At first, they were, worried about how people might take this. Like if we attack early, we can justify it by saying that Archduke got shot and we retaliated. Because early times, they cared about what people and the world thought. And after the war, they didn't care who thought what. They are just giving out warnings by doing genocides. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me. But that's just fucked up. Alright, people, that was the rape of Belgium and the Battle of Tannenberg. If you like my reaction, don't forget to like and subscribe. Check out the Rick Sunday. There's a link in the description. Check out the cast of place, link cards, and yeah, I'll see you next time.